In 79 C, Mount Vesuvius buried a bakery in Pompeii midshift, and inside the oven, archaeologists later found loaves of bread that had survived nearly 2,000 years, carbonized but intact. When food scientists finally studied what was actually in that bread, it turned out to share almost nothing in common with what comes out of a factory today, wrapped in plastic, 12 slices to a bag. For most of history, bread wasn't a snack. It was survival infrastructure, dense enough to march an empire on. Somewhere in the last 100 years, it quietly stopped being either. One of those carbonized loaves, pulled from a bakery near Pompeii and Herculaneum in the early excavations of the site, still had its maker's stamp pressed into the crust. The name of the baker, Quintus Gronius Verus, along with 8 pre-scored wedges, so it could be broken apart without a knife. That loaf now sits behind glass in the National Archaeological Museum of Naples, and it is round, heavy, and coarse. Nothing like the airy, uniform slices lining a supermarket shelf. That single object is the whole mystery in miniature. Same basic ingredients, wheat and water and heat, and yet a completely different food. To understand why, it helps to start with how much bread was actually expected to do. The Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, recorded that a Roman soldier's monthly grain ration came to roughly 2/3 of an Attic medimnus, worth about a kilogram of wheat a day. That grain arrived unmilled, on purpose, because whole kernels kept for months while flour spoiled in weeks. Every 8-man squad, a contubernum, ground its own ration by hand and baked it into panis militaris, coarse military bread, or boiled it into a thick, unglamorous porridge called pulse. On that ration, a legionary was expected to march roughly 20 Roman miles a day in armor, then build a fortified camp before nightfall. Here's the part that doesn't line up. That's nearly triple the wheat in a typical modern diet, eaten by men doing brutal physical labor daily, and by most nutritional measures, they weren't falling apart from it. Meanwhile, modern populations eat far less bread than that and still report feeling hungry an hour later. So the obvious explanation, that ancient portions were simply smaller, and people back then just needed less, falls apart immediately. They were eating more, not less, and doing harder physical work on it. Maybe then it's a modern habit problem. Maybe people just don't eat enough bread anymore for it to do anything. That doesn't hold either. Bread consumption in industrialized countries stayed remarkably steady across the 20th century. White sandwich bread has been a dietary staple in the United States and Western Europe for generations, eaten daily, often at every meal. The quantity isn't the missing variable. Something else changed, and it wasn't how much bread people were putting in their bodies. So what did change? The first thread leads back to the wheat itself, and specifically to a set of decisions made in the middle of the 20th century, not by farmers guessing, but deliberately. In the 1960s, the plant scientist Norman Borlaug helped develop semi-dwarf wheat varieties as part of what became known as the Green Revolution, shorter stalks, engineered to put far more of the plant's energy into the grain head instead of stem growth, dramatically increasing yield per acre. It is one of the most consequential agricultural achievements in human history, and it is credited with helping prevent famine for hundreds of millions of people. But yield and nutrient density turned out to be in tension with each other. In 2004, the biochemist Donald Davis, working out of the University of Texas at Austin, published a study in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition, comparing USDA nutritional data on 43 garden crops from 1950 against the same crops in 1999. Across the board, he found measurable declines in protein, calcium, iron, and vitamin content, a pattern researchers now call the dilution effect, where breeding for size and yield spreads the same amount of nutrients across a bigger, faster-growing plant. Wheat has shown this same signature in later studies. Modern high-yield cultivars, gram for gram, simply carry less protein and fewer minerals than the wheat varieties grown a century earlier, to say nothing of the emmer and einkorn varieties Roman bakers were working with, which multiple comparative studies have found run higher in protein, zinc, and phosphorus than modern bread wheat. The Roman loaf wasn't just bigger in ration size. It was denser in almost everything that made it worth eating. But the wheat itself is only half the answer, because breeding changes alone don't fully explain why a modern loaf disappears from the stomach so fast. The second thread is what happens to the grain after it's harvested, and this is where the real gap opens up. Roman bread was, by necessity, a slow food. Dough was left to ferment over long stretches, using natural leavening cultures, because commercial bakers' yeast didn't exist yet. Long fermentation does something specific at a chemical level. It gives naturally occurring enzymes time to break down phytic acid, a compound in whole grain that otherwise binds to minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium and blocks the body from absorbing them. Slow fermented, whole grain bread doesn't just contain more minerals, it makes more of them actually usable. Modern industrial bread runs on the opposite logic. Speed. Commercial yeast can proof a loaf in under 2 hours instead of the better part of a day, which is exactly why it became standard. A bakery can turn over dough almost 10 times faster. but that shortened fermentation window barely touches the phytic acid. So a modern loaf can list similar mineral content on a label and still deliver less of it into the bloodstream. And that's before factoring in the milling itself. Modern roller mills strip away the bran and germ, the fiber and nutrient-dense outer layers of the kernel, to produce the soft, uniform white flour consumers expect. Then in many cases, add that fiber back in only partially as an isolated additive in enriched or wheat bread. Fiber is precisely what slows digestion and produces the sensation of fullness. Strip it out, and the same calorie count moves through the body faster, spikes blood sugar harder, and leaves hunger behind sooner. So the real answer isn't the amount of bread, and it isn't a change in modern appetite. It's a double shift. A grain bread for yield instead of density, run through a process built for speed instead of digestion. Two separate systems, agriculture and industrial baking, independently optimizing for scale, and satiety quietly paying the price in both. There's a strange kind of loop in that carbonized Pompeii loaf, sitting untouched under museum glass for 2,000 years. It survived because it was dense enough, whole enough, to resist turning entirely to ash. The bread on a kitchen counter this morning won't survive the week on the shelf, let alone 2 millennia in volcanic rock. And it turns out that's not a coincidence. It's the same story, written twice, at 2 very different scales.